Good morning, friends. Happy New Year to all, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship at Stony Brook. My name is Mike Hoffman, and I am so happy to be serving as both service leader and worship associate on this first morning of 2023. I want to offer a special welcome to any of you who are visiting us here for the first time today. We are delighted to have you here with us, and we look forward to getting to know you. Please plan to stay following the service and join us as our guests for coffee hour, and today it is also Super Sunday. Here you'll find lots of friendly folks to answer any questions you may have about us. If you're viewing this service online, please go to our website for a link to small group chat after the service to meet with others in a smaller setting where you can get to know some of us even better. Now we enter into the sacred space of worship with the sounding of the morning bell. Please remain silent until the sound can no longer be heard. I've asked Michelle Maggio to light our chalice this morning. While she does that, I will be reading words by Lois Van Leer titled, "On the Brink of a New Year." We light this chalice on the brink of a new year, letting go of what has been, open and hopeful for what may come. Renewed, restored, ready to live life fully anew, may we move forward with intention. Our opening words for today's service, which is all about poetry, are by Angela Herrera. Ms. Herrera is the senior minister at First Unitarian Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this is from her book, Reaching for the Sun. What do you do with the secret verses of your heart, with your need for redemption, the story without words, with paradoxical truths too private and nuanced to share, that cannot be printed or spoken aloud? You weave their energy into a poem, carefully, carefully, over and under and through, luminescent strands that cannot be unteased until the poem is shot through with light from an unknown origin. And you whisper it into the dark, breeze forms delivered into the deep. Now please stand as you are willing and able, and join in singing hymn number 350, The Ceaseless Flow of Endless Time. Thank you, Peter and Dee Dee. I'm not a poet, though I have very occasionally dabbled in haikus. As a youth, I thought of poetry as something uncool, but I must admit that I'm glad I took on the task of leading this service, mostly to learn a bit more about poetry and poets and what makes this form of expression special. So, of course, I first consulted the experts at Wikipedia and learned that poetry can be traced back to the 25th century BCE. The earliest surviving Western Asian poetry, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was written in that time period. Every culture on earth has its poetry. For me, that means that it is perhaps the one global unifying language or art form. An eye-opening realization for me. Kind of like when I joined Ancestry.com and found that I have over 200,000 DNA matches with people all over the world. It reinforced for me the fact that we are all one family, all one people. As many of you know, music is very important in my life. It speaks a language that transcends prose. It touches me in places that words don't reach. Musical lyrics are one form of poetry. And then again, spoken poetry has its own music, created with tempo, rhythm, meter, and rhyme. Today's service is a collection of poems, some of them written by our own fellowship members. Some are our favorite poems, and we will hear the words of some of the greats in this art form. Thanks to all of you who have contributed to this effort. Instead of a typical minute of meditation today, we will allow a short moment of silence after each poem to let the words absorb into our consciousness. Our music today will consist only of hymns. Finally, due to overwhelming interest and demand, some of our poems today didn't make it into the order of service, and one or two may be out of order. Please bear with me, as I want to include as many as possible. Since coming to this congregation, I was introduced to the poetry of Mary Oliver. She was born in 1935 in a suburb of Cleveland and moved to Provincetown, Massachusetts in the 60s. Influenced by both Whitman and Thoreau, she is known for her clear and poignant observances of the natural world. In fact, according to a 1983 Chronology of American Literature called The American Primitive, one of Oliver's collection of poems presents a new, quote, a new kind of romanticism that refuses to acknowledge boundaries between nature and the observing self, unquote. Her creativity was stirred by nature, and Oliver, an avid walker, often pursued inspiration on foot. Her poems are filled with the imagery from her daily walks near her home. Shorebirds, water snakes, phases of the moon, and humpback whales. Here's one of my favorite of her poems. It's titled Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. I'd like to invite Susan Buckley to read another poem by Mary Oliver. This one is titled, Why I Wake Early. Seems to me very appropriate for this morning's service. Susan?
Thanks, Mike. This is a good poem for today. It's about beginnings. Hello, sun in my face. Hello, you who made the morning and spread it over the fields and into the faces of the tulips and the nodding morning glories, and into the windows of even the miserable and the crotchety. Best preacher that ever was, dear star, that just happens to be where you are in the universe, to keep us from ever darkness, to ease us with warm touching, to hold us in the great hands of light. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Watch now how I start the day in happiness, in kindness.
Thank you, Susan. I now call on another Susan, Susie Burns, to read her own newly written original poem titled, A Wish at the Waning of the Crescent Moon. Susie?
A wish at the waning of the crescent moon. On nights of the fingernail moon, we are all poets, scratching with pencil on scraps of paper, scribbling on napkins with stubborn pen, eager to share the voice of our own true heart. Nights like this are conduits for the muse that must rush onto the page to affirm once more that we are, in fact, here again together. Somewhat intact, somewhat broken. After all that has passed, and after all who have passed, we have indeed arrived at this tattered but new year, and must trust our impulse above all else to sing our song, unfiltered, unhalted, unedited, in that, at first, small but insistent voice, as we all hurtle through uncertainty towards an ecstatic possibility of everything and the inevitable terror of nothing. It is that song we must sing, for it is all we really have or ever have had to call our own. There is pure joy in it, and it longs to be heard, and we long to hear it in this, our new year.
Thank you, Susie. Now here is a poem written by our own Vivian Valoria Fisher. This one is titled, My Polyglot Friends. We've heard much of Vivian's poetry in this past year, so. Oh, sure.
Again, this is a product of taking long walks in the morning. Can you hear me okay? Am I close enough? Am I okay? Okay, there we go. I like to fancy myself a bit of a linguist. I've taught Spanish, French, Latin, Italian, and English. Trips to Europe let me spread polyglot wings. Within days, I've jumped both feet into the swing, conversing with whomever we're among. Puffed when I hear, "Oh, you speak my tongue." Each morning as Aurora stirs my feathered friends, my Petey and I walk along the paths that wends, beneath the stands of trees deciduous and pine, whose limbs resound with talk I can't divine. Who trilled that trill? Who called that call? I cannot name the singer that enthralls. I wish to understand who you are and what you say. I'll hurry home and your morning breakfast lay and draw your bath, as all of you expect, my multilingual crowd of plumage guests.
Thank you, Vivian. It's always something special when we get to hear from our own congregants, hearing their own poems, their own thoughts. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about Emily Elizabeth Dickinson, who was an American poet born in 1830. Little known during her life, she has since been regarded as one of the most important figures in American poetry. Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, into a prominent family with strong ties to its community. After studying at the Amherst Academy for 7 years in her youth, she briefly attended the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary before returning to her family's home in Amherst. Dickinson lived much of her life in isolation. Considered an eccentric by locals, she developed a penchant for white clothing and was known for her reluctance to greet guests or, later in life, to even leave her bedroom. Dickinson never married, and most friendships between her and others depended entirely upon correspondence. While she was a prolific writer, her only publications during her lifetime were 10 of her nearly 1,800 poems and 1 letter. The poems published then were usually edited significantly to fit conventional poetic rules. Her poems were unique for her era. They contained short lines, typically lacked titles, and often used slant rhyme, as well as unconventional capitalization and punctuation. Many of her poems deal with themes of death and immortality, 2 recurring topics in letters to her friends. She also explored aesthetics, society, nature, and spirituality. I'd like to invite Shelley Pesaris to read Dickinson's poem, "Hope is the Thing with Feathers."
Oops, I touched something. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me.
Thank you, Shelley. Joy Harjo is an internationally renowned performer and writer of the Muskogee Creek Nation. She served 3 terms as the 23rd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2019 to 2022. The author of 9 books of poetry, including the highly acclaimed An American Sunrise, several plays and children's books, and 2 memoirs, Crazy Brave and Poet Warrior. Her many honors include the Ruth Lilly Prize for Lifetime Achievement from the Poetry Foundation, the Academy of American Poets Wallace Stevens Award, 2 NEA fellowships, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. I'd like to invite June Shavani to read one of her favorite poems by Joy Harjo titled Eagle Poem.
To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you can't see, can't hear, can't know, except in moments steadily growing, and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle, that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky, in wind, it swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you. We see ourselves and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion, like eagle rounding out the morning inside us. We pray that it will be done in beauty, in beauty.
Unfortunately, Carol Castillo couldn't be here today, but she called my attention to a recent New York Times article in which Elisa Gabbard discusses Robert Frost, and specifically his poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Gabbard writes, "There's a kind of crystalline simplicity to much of Frost's work. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, which he wrote in 1923, 100 years ago, and later named as his own favorite poem, has a glowing, pristine quality, a snow globe perfection. We hear a Frostian note of uncertainty in Stopping by Woods. Whose woods these are, I think I know," Frost said. Frost said he wrote the poem very quickly, remembering a Christmas he'd spent in poverty. He had taken a wagon from his farm into town, hoping to sell some goods and come back with presents. But he'd had no luck and was reluctant to return. As Frost himself once put it, we need legitimate danger so that we may be genuinely rescued. We can think of his poem Horse as rescuing him, shaking its bells to shake him from his mesmeric reverie and bring him back home. In this view, the poem is both peaceful and frightening. The coziness depends on the threat. The shelter needs the storm. I'd like to ask Joan Kiley to come forward and to read this poem, as well as another one by Robert Frost, one of her favorites. Again, this one is called Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening.
Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Do you want me to sit down? Dust of Snow is one of my favorites, kind of different tone. Reminds me to look for something good. The way a crow shook down on me a dust of snow from a hemlock tree has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued.
Each Sunday, we share our plate offerings with an organization that does work in the world aligned with our principles. This is a spiritual practice. Our shared plate recipient for the month of January is Multicultural Solidarity, an organization co-founded by our own Joel Aw Diamond. Their signature program is Diversity, Unity, Friendship, and Sharing Circles to build relationships across the artificial divides while addressing issues of race, misogyny, and all the other prejudices. They also have social justice teams planning for transformation of structural racism on Long Island. Current teams are fair housing, diversity in schools, and transportation equity. Please give generously. Will the board members please come forward? Hear a short introduction, then we're going to all sing together through Spirit of Life, and then we're going to hear an instrumental verse by Peter and Dee Dee. Thank you. There's something different about just listening to that music without the words. That's so spiritual for me, so thank you. We continue our poetry readings with T.S. Eliot. Thomas Stearns Eliot, born in 1888, was a poet, essayist, publisher, playwright, literary critic, and editor. Considered one of the 20th century's major poets, he is a central figure in English language modernist poetry. Born in St. Louis, Missouri, to a prominent Boston Brahmin family, he moved to England in 1914 at the age of 25 and went on to settle, work, and marry there. He became a British citizen in 1927 at the age of 39, subsequently renouncing his American citizenship. Eliot's paternal grandfather, William Greenleaf Eliot, had moved to St. Louis, Missouri to establish a Unitarian church there. His father, Henry Ware Eliot, was a successful businessman. His mother, Charlotte Champ Stearns, who wrote poetry, was a social worker, which was a new profession in the U.S. in the early 20th century. Eliot was the last of 6 surviving children. Known to family and friends as Tom, he was the namesake of his maternal grandfather, Thomas Stearns. Dr. Oliver Turle provides an analysis of Eliot's classic Christmas poem, Journey of the Magi. He writes, Journey of the Magi by T.S. Eliot was the first of a series of poems written by the poet for special booklets or greeting cards which were issued in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Eliot claimed he wrote Journey of the Magi in 1927 on a single day, one Sunday after church. The speaker in the poem, one of the Magi, talks about the difficulties encountered by the Magi during the course of their journey to see the infant Christ. It is unconventional to focus on the details of the journey, their longing for home, their doubts about the point of the journey they're undertaking, the unfriendly people in the villages where they stop over for the night, and so on. Eventually, the Magi arrive at the place where the infant Christ is to be found. The poem ends with the poem's speaker reflecting on the journey years later, saying that if he had the chance, he would do it again. But he would add that we remain unsure about the precise significance of the journey and what they found when they arrived. June Cerveni will now read Journey of the Magi by T.S. Eliot.
A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels galled and sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes and terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. And at the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears saying that it was all folly. Then at dawn, we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation with a running stream and a water mill beating the darkness, and 3 trees in the low sky, and an old white horse galloping away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, and 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, and so we continued. And arriving at evening, not a moment too soon, finding the place, it was, you might say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago. I remember, and I would do it again. But set down, this set down, this. Were we led all that way for birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence, and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death.
I'd like to ask John Williams to read his original poem titled Deconstructing Once Upon a Time. I'm going to be bringing the mic to John. You may not be able to see him online, but you'll certainly hear his clear voice.
Deconstructing Once Upon a Time. When I was 9, the stories I read all began once upon. None of these things ever happened twice, it seemed. But children probably got lost in the woods quite often. A time, the stories continued, apparently centuries ago. Some of the stories seem to occur about 1538 or even a century or two earlier. Okay. Okay.
Are we okay to go? Okay.
Should I start over? But children probably got lost in the woods quite often. A time, the story continued, apparently centuries ago. Some of the stories seem to occur about 1538 or even a century or two early. It was a time of turmoil, but a brave warrior defeated evil and a just king regained his throne. At the end, things were better, but still without central heating or mass-produced consumer goods. Then usually in a far-off land. How did they know? It depended on where I was when I was reading the story. The pictures indicated strongly that it was Western Europe, but no ordinary place. Wales, maybe? I always wished there was a dimension of reality where all the old stories were still going on, and I could go to at least go to see if they were true. My brother said, if the universe was infinite, then there was.
We apologize for any technical difficulties there. This next poem is by the Sufi poet Hafiz, translated into English by Daniel Ladinsky. It's a favorite of Lorraine Stid, who couldn't be here today. How did the rose ever open its heart and give to the world all of its beauty? It felt the encouragement of light, of love against its being. Otherwise, one might be too frightened. The heart, even on its better days, can be just one wing needed to fly. The other wing, love, from someone else, or from a beautiful creature, or some synergy with a gorgeous mountain or sky, can cause your spirit to awake, unfurl, give thanks, and know joy. Colleen Rudman submitted two of her favorite poems for this service. She couldn't be here today, so I will read for her. Colleen writes, I've selected two short poems to read, loosely connected by the idea of waves. I first came across these poems in a college poetry class many years ago, and they stuck with me. The first is by the American poet Gary Snyder. Now aged 92, Snyder has been described as the poet laureate of deep ecology, which Wikipedia describes as an environmental philosophy that promotes the inherent worth of all living beings, regardless of their instrumental utility to human needs, and the restructuring of modern human societies in accordance with such ideas. That should sound familiar to most of us. I'm going to read Snyder's early poem, Wave, from his 1967 collection, Regarding Wave. To me, this poem is about the joy in seeing the connections and commonalities in life, expressed not only in the words, but also in the sounds of the wave, sounds of the words. Grooving clamshell, streak through marble, sweeping down ponderosa pine, bark scale, rip-cut tree green, sand dunes, lava flow, wave, wife, woman, wifeman, veiled, vibrating, vague, sawtooth ranges pulsing, veins on the back of the hand. Forked out, bird's foot alluvium wash. Great dunes rolling, each inch rippled, every grain a wave. Wind, shake, stiff thorns of kala, ocotillo. Sometimes I get stuck in thickets. Ah, trembling, spreading, radiating wife, racing zebra. Catch me and fling me wide to the dancing grain of things of my mind. Colleen's second selection is from the Kabir book, Ecstatic Poems of Kabir. Kabir was a 15th century Indian mystic poet and saint. Kabir was critical of organized religions and denounced the caste system. Again, sounds familiar. He suggested that the true God is only with the person who is on the path of righteousness and considered all creatures on earth as his own self. Kabir's writings inspired people hailing from all faiths, including Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. He wrote most of his poems in vernacular Hindi. The poem I'm going to read was translated by Robert Bly, a poet in his own right, who was interested in Eastern ecstatic poetry. I've been thinking of the difference between water and the waves on it. Rising, water's still water. Falling back, it is water. Will you give me a hint how to tell them apart? Because someone has made up the word wave, do I have to distinguish it from water? There is a secret one inside us. The planets in all the galaxies pass through his hands like beads. That is a string of beads one should look at with luminous eyes. This next poem is not in the order of service. That had to be prepared significantly ahead. But I would like to ask Lem Coley to read a favorite poem of his by the poet Philip Freed, who received his PhD in English right here at SUNY Stony Brook and was also a friend of Lem's. Lem? Come up here.
Oh. God, these stupid things. Sorry. First of all, I want to thank Mike for letting me get into this thing late, and then I want to apologize because, as I told him when I came, I'm not just dropping it on them. I couldn't find the poem by Phil Freed, who's an old friend of mine, and I've reviewed his poems, and I write for his poetry magazine sometimes. But the book in which the poem I wanted to read is located, his latest book, Among the Jalesians, has eluded me somehow. It's hiding from me. Sometimes I don't know why. But anyway, so I had to pick something else. And I asked Mike to mention Phil Freed anyway because he went to Stony Brook and he's he has a magazine out, and I mean he spent a lot of time here, and that's where I got to know him. We were both graduate students during I think the Nixon administration, and anyway. So I'm reading another poem, but I want to thank Mike, and I was thinking of what Mike said about not being a really just a giant poetry fan, and that's one of the great things about this fellowship, is that you do all sorts of things, you learn things, not just learn passively, but you learn by doing things that you wouldn't have done, and you get into stuff that you wouldn't have, and you learn all sorts of things, and it's just a great experience in that way. It has been for me. And listening to all this has been great. I mean, the variety of poetry. June read the poem by Joy Harjo from the Muskogees. I grew up in country that was taken away violently from the Muskogees in Alabama, and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, very close to my house, where they said for a while the Tallapoosa River was red with blood, and it was a pretty rough scene. So, and all these things. These different poets, John Williams, I've been reading John's poems for years, and I'm very fond of them, and he's got a real talent. And these other poets, and it's just great to hear this stuff. And again, the variety and the range of it is part of the pleasure. We celebrate diversity here. There's nothing like a poetry service to show you about diversity. And the the poet I want to read today, a last-minute substitute, is Frank O'Hara, who was a young poet. He's a part of a group of poets often called the New York Poets, and they came to New York in the 50s, and sort of coming off of the T.S. Eliot, the June read. In those days, poetry was sort of a formal, tense, rigorous kind of thing, and T.S. Eliot was sort of the king of it, and although he was old by then, and he was the king of it, and it was a very rigorous and very religious like that. He was very religious. He declared himself a monarchist in politics, a monarchist in politics, no, a royalist, not monarchist, royalist in politics, Catholic in religion. He didn't mean Roman Catholic, but he was a devout Christian. Anyway, and so these young poets came in, the New York poets, and John O'Hara, Frank O'Hara was one. John Ashbery, probably the best known, was they're all dying or retired now. Mike Sheljahl, who was an art critic for the New Yorker, died recently. Not Mike, Peter Sheljahl. Anyway, and they came in, and so because they're in this kind of atmosphere that you heard in June's poem, with this kind of formal, religious kind of, their poems often seemed as like they were trying to be anti-poems in some ways. They were trying to break out of that. What they saw by then had encrusted into this sort of shell of tense, rigorous, formal stuff. And so their poems often sound kind of casual. This is a poem called The Day Lady Died. And it's about the day Billie Holiday died. It's about being in New York. I think Frank O'Hara was working in a museum then. It's a Friday. He's just going about his business. And it's that thing of, instead of being this kind of poem about the praise of Billie Holiday, it's that thing of you're going through your ordinary life, and then something happens and plunges you into a deeper level, a deeper emotional level, a deeper level of feeling. So this is The Day Lady Died. It is 12:20 in New York, a Friday, 3 days after Bastille Day. Yes, it is 1959, and I go get a shoe shine, because I will get off the 419 in East Hampton at 7:15 and then go straight to dinner, and I don't know the people who will feed me. I walk up the muggy street, beginning to sun, and have a hamburger and a malted and buy an ugly New World writing to see what the poets in Ghana are doing these days. I go on to the bank, and Miss Stillwagon, first name Linda, I once heard, doesn't even look up my balance for once in her life. And in the Golden Griffin, I get a little Verlaine for Patsy with drawings by Bonnard, although I do think of Hesiod translated by Richard Lattimore, or Brendan Behan's new play, or Le Balcon or Les Nègres of Genet, but I don't. I stick with Verlaine after practically going to sleep with quandriness. And for Mike, I just stroll into the Park Lane liquor store and ask for a bottle of Strega, and then I go back where I came from to 6th Avenue and the tobacconist in the Ziegfeld Theater, get this, and casually ask for a carton of Gauloises and a carton of Picayunes and a New York Post with her face on it. And I'm sweating. I'm sweating a lot by now and thinking of leaning on the John Doerr in the 5 spot while she whispered a song along the keyboard to Mal Waldron, and everyone and I stopped breathing.
Thank you, Lem, for tying all that together. I'd like to conclude our poetry readings looking forward to the future. Our young people will keep poetry alive. Amanda Gorman is an American poet and activist born in 1998. Her work focuses on issues of oppression, feminism, race, and marginalization, as well as the African diaspora. Gorman was the first person to be named National Youth Poet Laureate. She published her poetry book, The One for Whom Food Is Not Enough, in 2015. In 2021, she delivered her poem, The Hill We Climb, at the inauguration of U.S. President Joe Biden. Her inauguration poem generated international acclaim, and shortly thereafter, 2 of her books achieved bestseller status, and she obtained a professional management contract. In February 2021, Gorman was highlighted in Time magazine's 100 Next list under the category of Phenoms, with a profile written by Lin-Manuel Miranda. That same month, Gorman became the first poet to perform at the Super Bowl when she delivered her poem, Chorus of the Captains, at Super Bowl 55. This is titled New Day's Lyric by Amanda Gorman. May this be the day we come together. Mourning, we come to mend. Withered, we come to weather. Torn, we come to tend. Battered, we come to better. Tethering by this year of yearning, we are learning that though we weren't ready for this, we have been readied by it. We steadily vow that no matter how we are weighed down, we must always pave a way forward. This hope is our door, our portal. Even if we never get back to normal, someday we can venture beyond it to leave the known and take the first steps. So let us not return to what was normal, but reach toward what is next. What was cursed, we will cure. What was plagued, we will prove pure. What we tend to argue, we will try to agree. Those fortunes we forswore, now the future we foresee. Where we weren't aware, we're now awake. Those moments we missed are now these moments we make. The moments we meet in our hearts, once altogether beaten, now altogether beat. Come, look up with kindness yet, for even solace can be sourced from sorrow. We remember, not just for the sake of yesterday, but to take on tomorrow. We heed this old spirit in a new day's lyric. In our hearts we hear it, for Auld Lang Syne, my dear, for Auld Lang Syne. Be bold, sang Time this year. Be bold, sang Time. For when you honor yesterday, tomorrow you will find. Know what we've fought, need not be forgot nor for none. It defines us, binds us as one. Come over, join this day just begun, for wherever we come together, we will forever overcome. Our closing words are by Joy Harjo, whose Eagle poem we heard June read earlier. When I began to listen to poetry, it's when I began to listen to the stones, and I began to listen to what the clouds had to say, and I began to listen to others. And I think, most importantly for all of us, then you begin to learn to listen to the soul of yourself in here, which is also the soul of everyone else. The flame is extinguished, but not our hope for the future, our courage in the face of crisis, or the love we share in all the world. Thank you for the beautiful gift of music today. Apologize for not introducing that hymn. For our benediction today, I've asked Shelley Pissaris to read one of her favorite poems by Jack Cornfield as our benediction. Shelley, you can come up here.
Blessings of a kind heart upon you. Blessings of the eyes of compassion upon you. Blessings of giving to the earth upon you. Blessings of the wisdom of the seasons upon you. Blessings of breathing freely upon you. Blessings of this moment upon you.
Go in peace.